Hey Riverside, Zach here again. Continuing to go through the Gospel Fluency Handbook with you. This was an 8-week study we did with our small group. And last week we talked about the section called The Gospel in Me. So we talked about how the gospel applies to every part of our personal lives. So Jeff moves on in this next section to a section called The Gospel in Us. So this section, The Gospel in Us, is saying not only does the gospel apply to us individually, but the gospel applies to us corporately as well as a church. So he starts to talk about some of these ways that the gospel applies to all of us as a church. Jeff starts this section by expressing that we need to, if we're trying to grow in gospel fluency, we have to have constant immersion. I don't know if you remember back to the first video I did, I related gospel fluency to language fluency. So learning to apply the gospel to every part of our life is like language fluency in that the easiest way to get there is by full immersion. You know how you learn a language the best? If you're constantly around that language, you're going to learn Italian a lot more easily if you're living in Italy than if you're just going to Italian class on a Thursday night, right? So what he means by this is we have to surround ourselves constantly with people who are speaking the truths of the gospel into our lives, people who love Jesus and who are committed to reminding us of the truths of the gospel for the everyday stuff of life. So this looks like more than just fellowshipping with your friends on a Sunday morning or even going to a small group on a Wednesday night. It looks like way different than that. This is everyday life, people interacting with you, reminding you of the truths of the gospel, your family, your friends. It's a constant thing. This is constant immersion in the gospel truths. And we need each other to remind one another of these truths. It's so easy if you're just doing this thing alone to forget. I'm constantly forgetting, and thankfully I have so many people in my life who are willing to remind me of these gospel truths consistently. So his first main point is if we want to reach more gospel fluency, we need to have this constant immersion. We have to have these people in our lives who are reminding us of these truths. And then Jeff starts talking about food. And I was like, okay, so you had me before, Jeff, but you're talking about food now? And whoo, here we go. I know a thing or two about food. I'm actually sitting down to have a meal with you guys as I talk to you about this. I have some leftover pizza that I heated up in the microwave. It should be absolutely delicious. I'm sorry, my diet and all of my dieting friends, I'm letting you down here. The carbs are real, but sometimes you just have to have a little pizza, you know what I'm saying? So anyway, food has a huge thematic presence in the story of God in the Bible. From the very beginning, we see food being one of the key elements in the life of Adam and Eve, right? So if we look back to the very first story with Adam and Eve, we see food playing a really large role, an important role in worship and remembrance of God, what he's done and what he's doing. God provided the garden for Adam and Eve. The garden was a wonderful place to live. There was as much food as Adam and Eve could possibly want to eat. He provided them with every meal that they had and everything that they need. And they had the opportunity to remember God's abundant provision and express their worship to him alone. When we eat, eating is such a sensory experience, right? So if I take a look at this pizza, eating starts with you look at the food, right? You're like, wow, that is a work of art. It's beautiful. I can see the multiple layers of sauce and cheese, and I can see the green basil on top. It just makes your mouth water, right? So eating starts with just looking at food. Sometimes I just scroll through Instagram looking at food. I get so hungry, it's crazy. And then sometimes you can even hear food. Have you ever gotten fajitas at a Mexican restaurant? You hear those things sizzling from the kitchen on out, and you're like, oh boy, it is time for fajitas. Am I right? And sometimes, to many people's chagrin, you can hear the smacking of people's lips, right, as they eat and enjoy their food. You can hear the crunching as you're eating some nice granola and yogurt. And then you smell your food, right? That's the next the next kind of sensory element of food, man, if your mom is cooking the next room over and you just smell that roast, oh, you are ready to go, right? And then you take a bite of the food, and that's where the party really starts. So you take a bite, you taste the flavor complexity, just an explosion of flavor, a party in your mouth. The saltiness, the sweet, the just gentle sweetness, slight bitterness. That's good pizza. The flavor is really, that's why we're here, right? We want to experience the flavor of this food. And the textures, right? We feel the food too. The slight crispiness, yet chewiness in this dough, it's like perfect. We love all of these things. Some people are just like texture people, right? They don't like certain things because of the texture. They love other things because of the texture. It's why I love sushi so much, I think, because it's just a textural sensation. Can you tell I like food? I like food a lot. But anyway, so food is this kind of full sensory experience, but then ultimately, like, why do we eat, right? Well, not only because we enjoy it, but also because it satiates us, right? Our needs are met through food. And it's this amazing, amazing reminder that God gave us that when we're eating, we can remember his provision, and we can remember the ways that he satiates us. If you remember what God said to Adam and Eve, he gave them full reign of the garden except for one thing, right? In Genesis 2:16, it says, "Eat from any tree in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you eat of that tree, you will surely die." Every meal that Adam and Eve had was an opportunity for them to remember and to trust and to obey God. He just had that one tree that they weren't allowed to eat. But they didn't remember, they didn't trust, and they didn't obey. They ate of the fruit anyway. God designed them and God designed us to trust in his ability to provide. We need something outside of ourselves to take care of a deep need that we have within, and he provides that. He provides that in Jesus, right? Adam and Eve were not supposed to look outside of his provision for anything. He gave them everything that they needed, but they ate and they proclaimed that they believed that his provision wasn't enough. We see God use food all throughout the Bible. It's actually really fun. If you want to do a study, go through the Bible and look for all of the places that God is using food. We even see it in the very next story with Cain and Abel and their food sacrifices that they were providing and the story that happened from that. We see that in a huge way, right, with the Passover, remembering God's provision in freeing his people from Egypt. And the sacrificial lamb, right, that they spread the blood over the doorposts and they were passed over, and their firstborn wasn't killed because of that. That's the Passover feast, right? And that's going to play a huge role in the rest of the Bible. Even the manna that God provides his people in the desert when they needed food, right? We see food all throughout the Bible. And when we get to Jesus, we see food in a huge way. Jesus is constantly using food imagery. Jesus calls himself the bread of life. Jesus provides living water, right? Think about how many miracles were involved with food and drink with Jesus. The wedding at Cana, all those people that he fed, right? Just so many food experiences in the Bible. His parables, when he's talking about farming, when he's talking about fruit, we see food once again, right? And Jesus' ministry, like he just centered things in so many ways around food. And ultimately, the Lord's Supper, right? His body was the bread and his blood was the wine for the Lord's Supper. Every single time we eat, we have an opportunity to remember that provision that Christ gave us, his body and his blood. And the way that he satiates our needs in a way that nothing else could. that we need him for our survival. Just like we need food for our physical survival, we need him for our survival in everything, right? We would be nowhere without his provision, without him being the bread of life, right? We need him. Imagine if we took every opportunity as we eat to remember these provisions. 1 Corinthians 10:31, Paul charges his followers and says, "Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God." What if we did this as a church? What if every time we had a meal, even like a little snack, a little granola bar in the afternoon, we used it to remember that we need God's care, we need God's provision for everything in our lives, and if we used it to remember his sacrifice for us. He was the perfect sacrificial lamb. What if we use these sensory experiences when we smelled food, when we tasted food, to remember what Jesus did for us, not only at the beginning of our meal, praying and thanking God for the provision of that meal, but all throughout the meal as we're experiencing this meal, using it as an opportunity for worship and thankfulness and remembrance of what he did for us. Meals can be a super, super awesome reminder of this, and I think if we're not doing this, we might be missing out on a huge opportunity that God is pointing us toward. So I encourage you, this is kind of my encouragement for this week. Spend some time thinking about how you can use food to help point you to remember the gospel. How can you use food to point your family to remember the gospel? As you eat these meals, remember what he did to you. Remember how he is the external provision. You couldn't do it yourself. Nothing from within you can provide what you need. It has to come from outside. It has to come from Jesus and what he did for you. And obviously, we do this as a church, right? We have the meal. We have the Lord's Supper, where we come together in communion to remember what he did for us on the cross. We had a really cool experience as a small group. We took communion together. We ate just a regular meal together, and then after the meal, we had a special time where we took the Lord's Supper together. And it was one of the most worshipful experiences I think many of us have had as a small group. It was so cool. Jeff gave us the idea, and what we did is before someone took of the bread and the cup, they would express, it could be something going on in their life, either a sin issue they were having or a struggle they're having in their life. Usually probably something we would present as like a prayer request, for example, just a situation that we're struggling with in life. And before we ate and drank, we would go around the table and everyone would remind that person of how the gospel speaks into that situation. So I won't share with you what others said, because it's kind of personal, and we're close, as a group. But I will share with you what I said. So we did this activity twice, where we took the Lord's Supper together and reminded each other's of the truths of the gospel. So what I told everyone is, I was like, man, I'm really struggling with inadequacy. I'm feeling like I'm just not good enough, whether it's at work or in ministry. I'm just not doing a good enough job. I just don't think that I have what it takes. And they just went around the table. Everyone reminded me very specifically of the truths of the gospel and how that applies to my exact situation. So I heard things like, well, Zach, remember, you don't have to be good enough. You aren't good enough. But Jesus is good enough, and he died for you and loves you, and he is providing for your needs. I heard things like, listen, it doesn't matter even if you're good enough or not. This is all Christ's work. Jesus is doing this work. You are not even a factor. So just going around the table and hearing these truths and then taking communion together was such a powerful experience for us. Just so many tears. And it helps so much to have that community of people to help you make these gospel connections and relate them to what Jesus did. It's so, so important to have that community. I really hope that you can find that community and the people around you. Find a small group, find a group of believers who are willing to remind you of these truths of the gospel. And remember, I also encourage you to think about how your meals could remind you of the truths of the gospel when you're just eating your everyday meals. Guys, thanks so much for joining me again. Thanks for kind of going with me on this journey, thinking about ways that we can apply the gospel to absolutely every part of life.